Welcome to our channel. Before we dive into today's epic Norse tale, don't forget to hit that like button. If you enjoy legendary Viking stories, subscribe for more mythological adventures, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We love connecting with our global Viking enthusiasts. Now, let's journey back to the age of longships and ancient prophecies. The bitter winds of winter howled across the fjords of Nordheim as smoke rose from the longhouses scattered throughout the valley. Snow clung to the thatched roofs like white fur, and the frozen ground crunched beneath the boots of those brave enough to venture outside. Inside the great hall of Jarl Thorvald, the warmth of the central fire pit cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls, adorned with shields and ancient runes. It was here, on this harsh winter night, that a prophecy would change the fate of an entire clan. Old Grimhild, the village seer, sat hunched beside the fire, her weathered hands tracing patterns in the ash. Her milky eyes, clouded with age and mystical sight, suddenly widened as she gazed upon the newborn child presented before the gathered villagers. The infant, barely hours old, had been found abandoned at the edge of the settlement, wrapped only in a wolf's pelt that seemed far too fine for any common family to possess. "Mark my words!" Grimhild's voice cracked like dry timber, echoing through the silent hall. "This child bears the mark of misfortune. His coming shall bring shadows upon our hearths and sorrow to our kinfolk. The ravens have whispered his name to me in dreams, and it speaks of endings." The villagers shifted uneasily, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Women pulled their own children closer, while men fingered the handles of their axes. Fear was a powerful force in these harsh lands, where survival depended on the favor of the gods and the unity of the clan. Jarl Thorvald, a man whose grey beard spoke of countless winters and whose scars told tales of battles won, stood silent for a long moment. His deep-set eyes studied the child, noting the unusual silver-blue shade of the infant's eyes and the strange birthmark on his shoulder that resembled the branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree. "The child is cursed," murmured Helga, the blacksmith's wife, her voice barely above a whisper. "We should leave him for the wolves before winter's end." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd like stones cast into still water. In these unforgiving times, the clan's survival came before sentiment, and a prophesied curse was not something to be taken lightly. But from the back of the hall, a figure stepped forward into the firelight. Leif the Wanderer was known throughout Nordheim as a man who walked his own path. Once a great warrior who had sailed to distant shores and faced sea monsters in the northern waters, he had chosen the life of a solitary hunter after losing his family to a plague years before. His presence commanded respect, even from those who whispered that his lonely existence had touched him with madness. "I will take the child," Leif announced, his voice steady and unwavering. The hall fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant howling of wind through the mountain passes. Jarl Thorvald raised an eyebrow. "You would defy the seer's warning, old friend? You would bring a cursed child under your roof?" Leif approached the bundled infant, his weathered face softening as he looked down at the peaceful, sleeping form. "I have faced death in many forms, my Jarl. I have sailed through storms that could split mountains and fought beasts that would make grown men weep. If this child is truly cursed, then perhaps only one who has already lost everything has nothing left to fear." He gently lifted the child, and remarkably, the infant opened those strange silver-blue eyes and looked directly at Leif without crying. It was as if some ancient understanding passed between them in that moment. "Besides," Leif continued, cradling the child against his fur-lined cloak, "the gods work in mysterious ways. What appears as a curse to some may be a blessing in disguise to others. I have learned that fate is not always what it seems." Old Grimhild shook her head vigorously, her gnarled fingers pointing at the child. "You court disaster, Leif Erikson. The dreams do not lie. This child will bring ruin upon us all when the time comes." "Then let the ruin come," Leif replied calmly. I have seen enough of this world to know that trying to outrun fate often leads us directly into its embrace. If the gods have placed this child in our path, there must be a reason. Jarl Thorvald studied both man and child carefully before nodding slowly. Very well, Leif. The child is yours to raise. But know this, should the seer's words prove true, the responsibility lies upon your shoulders alone. As the gathering dispersed and the villagers returned to their homes with worried whispers, Leif wrapped the child more securely in the wolf pelt and stepped out into the swirling snow. His own dwelling sat apart from the main settlement, built into the side of a hill and surrounded by ancient pine trees that creaked and swayed in the wind. The journey through the snow-covered paths gave Leif time to contemplate his decision. He had acted on instinct, moved by something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was loneliness after years of solitude, or maybe it was the way the child had looked at him with those remarkable eyes that seemed far too wise for one so young. Inside his humble home, warmed by a smaller hearth and lit by oil lamps, Leif prepared a place for the child. He had no experience with infants, but his practical nature served him well. He fashioned a cradle from a wooden chest padded with furs, and managed to find a goat in his small livestock pen that could provide milk. As he settled the child, whom he decided to call Magnus, meaning great in the old tongue, into the makeshift cradle, Leif noticed something extraordinary. The strange birthmark on the child's shoulder seemed to shimmer faintly in the lamplight, and for just a moment he could have sworn he heard the distant howling of wolves carried on the wind. "What are you, little one?" he whispered, gently stroking the child's fine hair. "What destiny do you carry in those ancient eyes?" Outside, the winter storm continued to rage, as if the very elements were responding to the child's presence. But inside the warm sanctuary of Leif's home, Magnus slept peacefully, his tiny hand grasping the wolf pelt as if it were a familiar comfort. As the days passed into weeks, and the weeks into months, Leif discovered that raising Magnus was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The child rarely cried, but when he did, it seemed that the very forest around their home would fall silent, as if even the animals were listening. Birds would often perch on the windowsills, cocking their heads as if trying to understand some unheard conversation. By his first summer, Magnus was walking steadily and speaking words in a dialect that seemed older than any Leif had ever heard. The child showed an unusual fascination with the forest, often pointing excitedly at deer that would approach closer than wild animals should, and laughing with delight when ravens landed nearby and cawed, as if in response to his babbling. The villagers kept their distance, crossing themselves with protective runes when they encountered Leif and the child during their infrequent visits to the settlement for supplies. The fear that had taken root the night of the prophecy had only grown with time and the retelling of that ominous warning. But Leif found himself more content than he had been in years. Magnus brought a light into his solitary existence that he hadn't realized he was missing. The child was intelligent beyond his years, learning quickly and showing a natural understanding of the forest and its creatures that amazed his adoptive father. One autumn evening, as orange and gold leaves danced on the wind and the first hints of winter's return touched the air, Leif was teaching Magnus to identify different animal tracks in the soft earth near their home. The boy, now walking confidently and speaking in full sentences, suddenly stopped and tilted his head, as if listening to something only he could hear. "Father Leif," Magnus said, using the name he had chosen for his guardian, "do you hear them singing?" Leif paused in his examination of what appeared to be wolf prints and listened carefully. He heard only the usual sounds of the forest, wind through the trees, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. "I hear the forest, little one, but no singing. What do you hear?" Magnus pointed toward the deeper woods, his silver-blue eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. "The grey singers. They say they've been waiting for me to grow strong enough to understand their words." A chill ran down Leif's spine that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. He had heard tales of children who could communicate with the spirit world, but had always dismissed them as the fantasies of worried mothers and superstitious elders. "What do they sing about, Magnus?" The child's expression grew serious, far too serious for one so young. They sing about the time of testing that comes with the snows. They say enemies approach our valley, and that you and I must be ready. As if summoned by the boy's words, a lone wolf emerged from the tree line. It was larger than any Leif had ever seen, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb the fading light. But instead of the predatory stance he expected, the great beast sat calmly and regarded Magnus with what could only be described as recognition. Magnus walked toward the wolf without fear, and Leif's hand instinctively moved to his axe handle. But something in the scene, the peaceful nature of the encounter, the way the wolf's intelligent eyes tracked the child's movement, stayed his hand. "Hello, Grey Singer," Magnus said softly, extending his small hand toward the massive creature. "Father Leif, this is the leader of the pack. His name sounds like wind through stone, but I think you would call him Fenris." The wolf, Fenris, allowed the child to place his hand on its great head, and for a moment that seemed suspended in time, boy and beast regarded each other with perfect understanding. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf melted back into the forest shadows. Leif stared after the vanished creature, his mind racing. The name Fenris carried great significance in the old stories. It was associated with wolves of unusual size and intelligence, creatures said to serve as messengers and guardians for those touched by the gods. "Magnus," he said carefully, lifting the boy into his arms, "we should return home now. The night grows cold, and there is much we need to discuss." As they walked back toward their dwelling, Leif's thoughts churned like storm clouds. The child he had rescued from prophecy and fear was clearly no ordinary boy. The question that haunted him was whether Magnus represented the salvation or the doom that old Grimhild had foreseen. That night, as Magnus slept peacefully in his bed and the first snow of winter began to fall, Leif sat by the fire and contemplated the path that lay ahead. He had chosen to defy fate by saving the child, but perhaps fate had chosen him in return. The Grey Singers, the wolves, spoke of enemies and testing times ahead. Looking at the sleeping boy whose silver-blue eyes moved beneath closed lids, as if he were seeing visions in his dreams, Leif made a decision that would echo through the ages. Whatever destiny awaited Magnus, whatever role the child was meant to play in the coming trials, Leif would stand beside him and help him fulfill his true purpose. The wind outside picked up, howling through the mountain passes with a sound that resembled the distant calls of a great pack on the hunt, and somewhere in the deeper wilderness, answering howls rose in response, as if an ancient alliance was stirring to life once more. 3 winters had passed since that first encounter with the Grey Singer, and Magnus had grown into a remarkable child of 4 summers. His silver-blue eyes had deepened in color, and the strange birthmark on his shoulder had become more pronounced, resembling not just the branches of Yggdrasil, but also the constellation that the Scald called the Crown of Kings. Leif watched his adopted son with a mixture of pride and growing concern. For with each passing season, the boy's unusual abilities became more apparent. The child could predict weather changes days in advance, simply by listening to what he called the sky's breathing. He knew when wolves were near long before any human ear could detect their presence, and forest animals showed him a deference that bordered on reverence. Most remarkably, Magnus had begun to speak of dreams filled with fire and ice, great battles, and a destiny that stretched beyond the confines of their peaceful valley. On this particular morning, as spring's first warmth began to melt the snow from the mountain peaks, Magnus burst into their home with unusual excitement. His cheeks were flushed from running, and his eyes sparkled with an intensity that always appeared when he had experienced one of his prophetic dreams. "Father Leif," he called, nearly stumbling in his haste. "The Grey Singers came to me again last night, but this time they brought others, the White Singers from the high peaks and the Brown Singers from the deep forests. They all sang the same song." Leif set down the leather harness he had been repairing and gave Magnus his full attention. Over the years, he had learned to take the boy's dream visions seriously, for they had never proven false. When Magnus had dreamed of a hard winter 2 years prior, Leif had prepared extra stores that had saved them both from starvation during an unexpectedly brutal season. "Tell me about this song, little one. What did they sing to you?" Magnus climbed onto the wooden bench beside his adoptive father, his small hands gesturing expressively as he spoke. They sang of ships with dragon heads coming across the great water. Many ships, filled with men who carry sharp metal and burning anger in their hearts. The singers say these men have heard stories of our valley's wealth, the silver veins in the mountains and the fertile lands that feed our livestock. Leif's expression grew grave. Raiders from across the sea were a constant threat to coastal settlements, but their isolated valley had always been considered too remote and difficult to reach to attract such attention. If Magnus's vision was true, it suggested that word of Nordheim's prosperity had somehow reached the ears of those who would take it by force. "How long do we have, Magnus? Did the singers tell you when these dragon ships would arrive?" The boy closed his eyes, as if trying to recall every detail of his dream. "When the snow has melted completely from the lower paths, and the spring flowers bloom in the meadows where the deer graze. The singers showed me the moon's face. It will be full and bright, like a silver shield in the sky." Leif calculated quickly. By Magnus's description, they had perhaps a month before the raiders would arrive. It was time to warn the village, though he dreaded the reception they would receive. The fear and suspicion that had surrounded Magnus since birth had only grown stronger as stories of his unusual abilities spread among the villagers. "We must go to Jarl Thorvald," Leif decided, rising and reaching for his warmest cloak. "If raiders truly approach, the village needs time to prepare defenses." Magnus nodded solemnly, but then grasped his father's arm with small fingers that seemed to carry surprising strength. "Father Leif, there's more. The Grey Singers showed me something else, something about my purpose here. They say the coming battle will reveal who I truly am, and why the old seer's prophecy was only half the truth." As they made their way through the forest paths toward the main settlement, Leif pondered Magnus's words. The child had always been mysterious, but lately his statements carried the weight of ancient knowledge. It was as if some sleeping power within him was beginning to stir. The village of Nordheim lay spread across the valley floor, like a collection of wooden jewels against the green landscape. Smoke rose from numerous hearths, and the sounds of daily life, hammering from the smithy, lowing cattle, children at play, drifted on the morning air. But as Leif and Magnus approached the settlement, Leif noticed that conversations stopped and people withdrew into their homes, casting nervous glances at the strange child who walked beside him. In the great hall, they found Jarl Thorvald discussing trade matters with several of the village elders. The hall fell silent as they entered, and Leif felt the familiar weight of suspicious stares. Old Grimhild, now even more bent with age, sat in her customary place by the fire and fixed her cloudy eyes on Magnus with undisguised hostility. "Jarl Thorvald," Leif began formally, "I bring urgent news that concerns the safety of our people." The Jarl gestured for them to approach, though Leif noticed that several of the elders stepped back as Magnus drew near. "Speak, old friend. What news do you bring from your forest dwelling?" "Raiders approach our valley," Leif stated simply. "Many ships filled with armed men who have heard tales of our prosperity. They will arrive when the spring moon is full, less than a month from now." A murmur of concern rippled through the assembled villagers, but Elder Orm, a man whose family had lived in the valley for generations, scowled and pointed accusingly at Magnus. "And how do you come by this information, Leif? Through the whispers of the cursed child you harbor, we should not make decisions based on the fevered imaginings of one touched by dark spirits." Before Leif could respond, Magnus stepped forward with a composure that seemed far beyond his years. When he spoke, his young voice carried an authority that silenced the room. "Elder Orm, you speak of dark spirits, but you understand little of the forces that move through this world. The Grey Singers who bring me visions are not creatures of darkness. They are servants of the All-Father, messengers who have watched over this valley since your grandfather's grandfathers first built their homes here." Old Grimhild cackled from her place by the fire. Listen to how the cursed child speaks, with the arrogance of one who believes himself chosen by the gods. I warned you all on the night of his arrival. He will bring ruin upon us." Magnus turned his silver-blue gaze on the ancient seer, and for a moment the air in the hall seemed to thicken with unseen power. "Seer Grimhild, your sight reaches far, but it does not reach far enough. You saw the shadow of my coming, but missed the light that would follow. Yes, I will bring change to this valley, but not the destruction you fear." Jarl Thorvald raised his hand for silence, his weathered face thoughtful. "Child or not, touched by spirits or blessed by gods, if there is even a chance that raiders approach, we must prepare. Leif, your warnings have always proven true in the past. Tell us, what does the boy's vision show of these enemies?" Magnus closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they seemed to hold depths like the deepest fjords. "I see 3 ships with carved dragon heads, painted red and black. The leader is a man with a braided beard who wears a helm decorated with raven wings. They know of the silver mines in the high caves and believe our warriors are few and unprepared." "How many men?" asked Beata, the village's war leader. 60, perhaps 70. They expect to take the village by surprise and meet little resistance, but they do not know about the ancient alliance that sleeps in these forests, waiting to be awakened. Grimhild's eyes widened with sudden fear. "Ancient alliance? Child, what dark pacts do you speak of?" Magnus looked directly at her, and for the first time since entering the hall he smiled, an expression both innocent and deeply knowing. "Not dark, old mother. Ancient, yes, but forged in the light of Asgard itself. You will see when the time comes. The Grey Singers have been patient, but their patience has a purpose." As the debate continued around them, Leif noticed something remarkable happening. Despite their fear and suspicion of Magnus, the villagers were beginning to organize defense preparations based on his warnings. Jarl Thorvald assigned men to watch the approaches to the valley. Weapons were gathered and sharpened, and plans were made for protecting the women and children. Over the following weeks, as spring advanced and the snow melted from the lower elevations, Magnus's behavior began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. He spent long hours standing at the edge of the forest, seeming to listen to sounds only he could hear. His dreams became more vivid and specific, providing detailed information about the approaching raiders' plans and weaknesses. One evening, as the full moon of Magnus's prophecy began to wax toward completeness, Leif found the boy sitting outside their home, gazing up at the star-filled sky with an expression of profound concentration. "The time draws near, doesn't it?" Leif asked, settling beside his adopted son. Magnus nodded slowly. "Father Leif, tomorrow night the ships will beach in the hidden cove beyond the eastern ridge. The raiders plan to attack at dawn the following day, when they believe the village will be sleeping and unprepared. And you? What role will you play in the coming battle?" For the first time in days, Magnus looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. "The Grey Singers say I must trust in the ancient ways, in the bonds that tie all living things together. They say I must not be afraid of who I truly am, even if it frightens others." Leif placed a protective arm around the boy's shoulders. "Magnus, whatever happens, whatever power flows through you, remember that you are my son in all the ways that matter. You have brought more joy to my life than I ever dared hope for. Trust in yourself and trust in the love that connects us." The next day passed with agonizing slowness as the village made final preparations for the expected attack. Warriors took positions at strategic points, families gathered their most precious possessions, and an atmosphere of tense anticipation settled over Nordheim like morning fog. As evening approached, Magnus sought out Jarl Thorvald and the village elders one final time. "The ships have arrived," he announced simply. 73 men, just as I foresaw. They will attack with the dawn, coming from 3 directions to divide your forces. "And what would you have us do, child?" Jarl Thorvald asked, his voice showing the strain of the long day's preparations. Magnus straightened to his full height, and for a moment he seemed far taller and older than his 4 years. "Place your trust in the ancient alliance, my Jarl. When the battle is joined and hope seems lost, look to the forest. The grey singers will answer the call of their king. Grimhild, who had been silent for most of the day, suddenly gasped and pointed at Magnus with a trembling finger. "King? You speak of kingship, child. What madness is this?" Magnus turned to face her one final time, and in his silver-blue eyes she saw something that made her ancient heart skip with recognition. It was the look of one born to rule, the bearing of nobility that could not be learned or feigned. Not madness, old mother. Destiny. "The prophecy you spoke on the night of my arrival was true. I am indeed connected to endings. But every ending is also a beginning, and every destruction carries within it the seeds of new creation." As the villagers settled into their defensive positions for the long night ahead, Leif and Magnus returned to their forest home one last time. The boy seemed different now, as if the approaching confrontation had awakened something fundamental within him. "Father Leif," Magnus said as they sat by their familiar hearth, "whatever you see tomorrow, whatever I become in the heat of battle, know that the love between us will never change. You saved me from fear and raised me with kindness. That bond will endure beyond whatever revelation's dawn may bring." In the distance, carried on the night wind, came the sound that had become familiar over the years, the howling of wolves gathering in the deep forest. But tonight, the howls seemed different, more purposeful, as if great packs were converging from all directions toward a single point. Magnus stood and walked to the window, his young face illuminated by moonlight. "They come," he whispered. "The ancient alliance stirs. Tomorrow Nordheim will learn that some prophecies speak not of doom, but of deliverance." Why this? As Leif watched his extraordinary adopted son standing silhouetted against the night sky, he realized that the child who had arrived wrapped in wolf's fur 4 years ago was about to fulfill a destiny that none of them, not even the prophetic Grimhild, had truly understood. The battle for Nordheim would be more than a clash between raiders and defenders. It would be the awakening of an ancient power that had slumbered in the northern forests for generations, waiting for the right moment and the right child to call it forth. And in that calling, Magnus would finally understand the true meaning of the birthmark he bore, not just the branches of Yggdrasil, but the crown of kings, marking him as heir to a legacy written in starlight and wolf song. Years later, when skalds sang of the Battle of Nordheim, they would tell of the morning when the mists parted to reveal an army of wolves standing alongside the village defenders, led by a child whose eyes reflected the wisdom of ages. They would speak of how Magnus, no longer just the cursed foundling, but revealed as the lost heir of the legendary Wolf Kings, united the ancient pact between humans and the Grey Singers to protect the innocent. The raiders fled that day, their ships damaged beyond repair, carrying tales of supernatural forces that would keep other would-be invaders away for generations. Magnus grew to become not just a protector of Nordheim, but a bridge between the world of men and the ancient spirits of the northern wilderness. Leif lived to see his adopted son crowned as Jarl, ruling with wisdom that honored both human needs and the natural world. And though old Grimhild never fully admitted her error, she lived long enough to see that some prophecies are meant not as warnings of inevitable doom, but as promises of hope disguised in shadow. The wolf's pelt that had wrapped the infant Magnus was preserved in the Great Hall, a reminder that sometimes the greatest destinies arrive in the humblest packages, and that love, whether between father and son, or between the human world and the wild, can transform even the darkest prophecy into a tale of triumph. In the end, Magnus proved that he was indeed connected to endings. The ending of fear, the ending of division between the civilized and the wild, and the ending of the belief that fate cannot be shaped by courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. Thank you for joining us on this epic journey through the age of Vikings and ancient prophecies. If this tale of destiny and redemption resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more Norse mythology adventures, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until our next mythological voyage, may your path be guided by wisdom and courage.